Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Afrigan. This day, March 4th, 1855, in Istanbul, Turkey, a sanitary commission arrives at a hospital that is treating wounded British soldiers from the Crimean War. Istanbul was Constantinople at the time. I believe there's a song about that. Anyway, the soldiers at this hospital were dying at an alarming rate, and not just from their wounds, but from illness. Conditions in the hospital were horrific, and nurses at the field hospital were doing all they could to stem the tide. Among the nurses was Florence Nightingale, perhaps the most famous nurse in history, and this moment, this experience in hospitals during the Crimean War, would help establish her reputation not just when it came to nursing, but when it came to data visualization as well. Because Florence Nightingale was able to tell a story through data and graphics about how conditions at the hospital began to improve. So a really fascinating story, one that has lots of interesting echoes for today. So here to discuss, as always, is Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Niki.
Hello, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello, Kellie.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode is Tim Harford, writer, economist. He's done many, many wonderful things that I am a fan of. But the latest book is called The Data Detective, and his podcast is called Cautionary Tales. The new season of the podcast has the story of Florence Nightingale and data viz, and the new book, I gather, has a chapter on that as well. So, Tim, thank you for doing this. This is great.
Oh, it's my pleasure. A special guest. I like that.
What else are we going to do? We're not just going to call you the guest. Right? You have to be the special guest.
The so-so guest.
Yeah.
Well, look, if all the guests are special, then none of the guests are special, right?
Well, okay. Our increasingly difficult guest, Tim Harford, is here.
Oh, that escalated quickly.
Yes. Okay, so take us to this moment, and then we'll get into the whole world of data viz. But, since we do want to hook it to a moment, March 1855, there is this battle in Crimea, and a sanitary commission shows up in Istanbul. Why is this an interesting moment to you, Tim?
To me, it's an interesting moment because this is the pebble that launches an avalanche of both public health reform that saves millions of lives and also triggers a revolution in data visualization. And both of these things start at this moment. And there's not much sign of it at the time. The basic problem in Istanbul is that this is away from the front line. No, Istanbul is not in Crimea, but it's the hospitals in Istanbul are in a terrible state. In charge of the nursing at those hospitals is Florence Nightingale, probably still the most famous nurse in the world. And she has requested help to clean up the hospitals, and arriving at the hospitals comes this sanitary commission. It's their job to sort everything out. And Nightingale later tells a story about what happened. She tells that story using graphs, and that story becomes incredibly influential.
Yeah, it's such an important moment in just the sanitation revolution. I mean, to take listeners back, it's a time in which there are sort of open sewers running around this hospital. There are carcasses everywhere of like dead horses and different things. And in a pre-germ theory era, the idea that these are exacerbating the spread of infectious diseases is just not something people have totally gotten yet. And so even though it seems so straightforward to us today, Nightingale was doing something kind of revolutionary here.
Yeah, I mean, they found a dead horse in the water pipe supplying water to the hospital. Let's not sugarcoat it.
Oh.
And I think even then, there was the sense that that's probably not good.
Fair.
Might be a problem.
Oh, that's gross.
But they didn't have a theory of germs. So that comes later. Robert Koch, Louis Pasteur, that comes 20, 30 years later. So there were various ideas about what was going on, and the idea that Nightingale had was actually it's all about bad smells. And so she's very interested in ventilation. So they don't really know how to clean up these hospitals. They don't really know what will help and what won't help, but they try a few things. But what to me I think is fascinating is that having done this, and the results seem to be great. I mean, enormous number of soldiers are dying in these hospitals. The mortality rate was, I think, early in 1855, it was more than 50% of the soldiers who showed up then died, and almost all of them died of disease, not of wounds. But why this is a story about more than just the Crimean War or more than just this couple of hospitals in Istanbul is because Nightingale then takes her experience back to London, back to the British Empire, where she is one of the most famous people in the whole British Empire. And she says, we've learned some lessons and we need to clean up not just those hospitals in Istanbul, but every hospital, not just every military hospital, but every civilian hospital. And we need to clean up the barracks, and we need to clean up the slums. I've seen these things, but not only have I seen these things with my own eyes, but I've got the data, and I'll show you the data, and I will show you the data in a way that you will not be able to argue with. And the reason she needed to make this argument very concrete and very persuasive was because although she was very famous and very influential, she's a woman in a man's world. And the military establishment and the medical establishment don't like what she's saying. They're embarrassed. And they think, and this is the kind of thing you may have heard during the time of coronavirus, that people are saying things like, well, there's not really anything we can do about these deaths. Yeah, sure, people die of these infectious diseases, but what can you do? People are going to die. Just suck it up. And Nightingale's, no, these are preventable deaths, and we prevented them out in Istanbul, and I'll show you how we prevented them, and we need to do it again and again and again.
Yeah, and I think it just goes to show you how much her data collection and her ability to be able to not just tell, but also show like how this works, I think was really provocative and compelling because, women were not prone to be believed for anything. So being able to have this statistical data for the first time really gives legitimacy to what she's saying or credence to what she's saying in ways that sort of layers her believability because of who she is. So, and it really does set like a framework or a groundwork going forward in terms of how stats and data and graphs and even maps get used to back up or bolster your argument before authorities.
Absolutely. So she's a nerd. Let's be, and I mean that in the most sincere, profoundly admiring way. She's a proper nerd, and as well as being interested in the nerdy stuff, in the analysis of data, in the standardization of data. Unlike everybody else in this community, she's really interested in communication. So you can see this in her letters. So she writes one letter about a presentation of data, and she said, well, it's presented like this in 2 columns and all the numbers. I don't think anybody will read it. And so she draws instead these amazing pictures of data. Now, to us, graphs, like pictures of data visualization, they're everywhere. We hardly notice them because they're so ubiquitous. But at the time, particularly in the UK, there was a bit of data visualization going on in France. But in the UK in the 19th century, people didn't do that. People didn't draw pictures. The pictures were thought to be superfluous. What does the picture add when you've got the numbers? And she understood that, no, there's a very potent visual sense. And she was very explicit about this. She would say things like, whenever I am enraged, I revenge myself with a diagram. Or she would talk, at one point she said, she talks about sending a report to Queen Victoria and saying, well, she may look at it because it has pictures. Can I tell you about the graph?
Yeah.
Because
Sure.
It's very,
Let's
it's
try
really
it.
so cool. So cool. And there's a twist as well. So, I mean, I've seen this graph in an original printing in the library of the Royal Statistical Society, and it is breathtaking. And it's worth Googling the graph. It's Florence Nightingale rose diagram is what you need to Google. And it's basically two blue spirals. And the spirals are made up out of wedges. So imagine pizza sliced into wedges, but the wedges are all different. They've all got the same angle, but some of them are sprawling off the edge of the plate, and some of them are kind of really small slices, and they're right near the middle of the plate. So you've got these big blue wedges, and they spiral. The first spiral goes out, 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 out. And what that is indicating is month by month, deaths from disease in the British Army, in the war in Crimea. They're getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And that's like this huge spiral. And then there's the second spiral, and the second spiral is smaller, and it goes the other way. It's spiraling inwards, and it's showing deaths going down. The main thing going on in this graph is a story of catastrophe followed by recovery. There's a before and there's an after. And this moment, early in March 1855, when the Sanitary Commission arrives in Istanbul, that is the moment that she divides this graph into the before and after. That's why it's such a powerful piece of visual rhetoric. Do you want to hear the twist?
Yeah.
So modern data visualization geeks are really divided about this graph. A lot of people think it's amazing. A lot of people think it's clumsy and confusing. And they say, why don't you just plot a bar graph? And if you plot a bar graph, I would say it is indeed a lot clearer. And it's a lot clearer in a very revealing way, because you lose the before and after structure. What you see is this big sort of, it looks like the deaths from coronavirus, this sort of first wave structure you see in a lot of countries. There's this big wave of deaths, and then the wave falls away again. And you don't see the same kind of before-after thing. You see that before the Sanitary Commission arrived, deaths were already falling. You see deaths continue to fall after the Sanitary Commission arrives. You wonder, is there a break? Is there a step change? Or is it just continuous gradual progress? And, hang on, that's winter. Maybe it's just winter went away. Maybe the weather got better. Maybe it's something else. Now, we happen to know that it turns out that if you have horses in your water supply, that's really bad, and that will kill people, and it's a good idea to get rid of them. And we know all of that. But the way Nightingale plotted her graph, it made it seem as though there's no possible alternative explanation. It must have been the Sanitary Commission. So the data were absolutely robust. The conclusion was absolutely correct. The visualization, a little bit naughty. And it does make me think about all the data visualizations we've seen ever since then, many of which are also a little bit naughty. So it's like she opened Pandora's box, and now we can't put the lid back on.
I do want to highlight one thing, though, in what you just said, which I think, you pointed out the fact that her numbers were sound and she'd done the hard work of data collection. Almost weirdly gets dismissed, or people don't talk about it in here. And it's and then to me, that's what I've learned about this world. It's your data has to be sound, and then you take that step to present it. But so often people maybe start to be lazy with that first step, or skip that first step, or manipulate that first step in the rush to get to something pretty and compelling.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a really interesting, revealing mistake that people make when they talk about Nightingale. So there's this very famous statement, which is generally attributed to William Farr, this great statistician and an ally of Nightingale, writing to Nightingale. And the statement is, you complain that your report would be dry. The drier, the better. Statistics should be the driest of all reading. And so people imagine this dusty old Victorian guy. He's got this great big beard, and he's writing to this young firebrand woman, and he's telling her, to play it straight, to keep it dry, and fortunately she ignores him. And I think this is the picture that people have, and there's a little bit of admiration of Nightingale, but also a little bit of sexism. And I looked into this when I was researching The Data Detective, and I realised the biographers have all got it wrong. That letter didn't go from Farr to Nightingale. That letter went from Nightingale to Farr. And the reason people got confused is because we only have a draft of the letter and the draft isn't signed. But we know that the letter went to Farr from Nightingale. And so she was telling him, keep it dry, play it straight, which is a weird contradiction because she drew these amazing pictures. But I think what she was getting at was, if you're going to perform this amazing visual acrobatics with the data themselves have got to be absolutely robust.
Yeah.
What I appreciate about all of Florence Nightingale in this history, in this moment, is that I think the public traditionally thinks of nurses as just providing care and not doing research. And this shows that nurses, when you look at the fullness of their position, they have to do research and they have to provide care at the same time. It can't just be one thing. And I also think that we only think of maybe doctors as writing up reports or sort of doing this kind of research and publications and all of that. But nurses do this as well. And I think she's really setting a precedent for how nurses provide care and conduct research.
I think that's right. And there's a class thing going on. Let's be clear. Florence Nightingale came from a very privileged family who were, in fact, appalled at the idea that she would become a nurse. That was... as far as they were concerned, that was very similar to saying that she was going to go into sex work. I mean, it's the nursing, to be quite frank, nursing in the 19th century didn't have a great reputation. But she changed that. She, more than anybody, I would say, professionalized nursing. So quite apart from her work in the Crimean War in these hospitals in Istanbul, and quite apart from all her work on public health, and quite apart from all her work on statistics, she also set up a nursing college and had professional standards of training of nurses. And so, her contribution to nursing, I mean, I'm a geek, right? So I study her contribution to geekery, but she also has this amazing contribution to nursing and the professionalization of nursing. And I mean, just really a remarkable person.
Yeah. But one way in which I think all of those things connect to me is, I often feel like the most important part of data journalism is the journalism side, right? It is the doing the hard work of gathering information, living in the world, having a lived experience, talking to people, gathering data, and then turning it into storytelling of some sort. And that's what good journalists do, right? They don't just swoop in and kind of, they actually live it. And I think that's what you see in Florence Nightingale. I don't know if we think of her as a journalist, but we think of her, she's certainly a persuader, right? And a storyteller. But, I think, Kellie, to your point of like her doing the hard work, and Tim, to your point of like these different parts of her life, all of that was research and journalism and gathering to bring to this moment where then she can then do this act of persuasion.
Yeah, absolutely. She was there. She called it the kingdom of hell, those hospitals in Istanbul. And she was working 20-hour days for months. And then she got sick and she nearly died. And she spent several decades doing this work that we've described from her bedroom. I mean, talk about a pandemic icon. And only really about the age of 70, she began to recover. So she spent the best years of her life bedbound and extremely ill with this recurring illness that we're not sure exactly what it was. We've got some theories. And finally started feeling better. And then she had another more than a decade. She died when she was nearly 90, I think. So she went through the ringer. She really did live it.
I mean, it's such a great story about the power of persuasion, and yet at the same time, like the hair standing up slightly on the back of my neck, because ultimately, like, it's those persuasion skills that can be used by manipulating and being more than a little naughty with the underlying data in order to influence and persuade people for things that maybe aren't true, maybe aren't in their best interest, maybe are being used to manipulate them. So as much as like the heroism of data visualization is important, it also seems like there are some red flags on the horizon as well.
It's a double-edged sword.
Yeah. It's. I mean, the way I describe it in Cautionary Tales is it's a dual-use technology. It's just one of those things. It's like nuclear power or something. I mean, it's amazingly useful and also can be used to do tremendous harm. And you can really see, so one of the studies that I briefly describe in the Cautionary Tale is of people processing visual information in 500 milliseconds. So that's half a second. And within half a second, having a positive or a negative impression of a graph. So you can't possibly take in any serious information about this graph. You can't know what it's about. You certainly can't evaluate any of the claims in it. But you can say, within half a second, oh, that's a mess, or ooh, shiny. And we form these impressions so quickly, and boom, we just hit retweet. We just shared on Facebook.
Oh, Hillary Clinton has a 98% chance of winning. Okay, great.
So powerful, and
hey, if anyone's scarred about that, it's me.
I don't think we can blame the data viz for that one.
Right? No, I mean, but I will say, I mean, in my time at 538, like I think this was a big thing that people struggled with and spent time thinking about was the actual presentation. Sometimes it comes down to just something as small as like, what's the shading of this color? Or do we put a big number there? And does the number have a decimal point? Because that gives it like an air of specificity when in fact we want to paint a picture, And I've said it on this show before, but I've come to this sort of larger understanding that the data is just like one of 4 storytelling tools, and you have to do the hard work to sort of present it as such. It can't, and ideally it's starting a conversation, not feeling like the end of a conversation and this sort of finality and simplicity. My question for you, Tim, is, was Florence Nightingale at all aware of any of these pitfalls? Did she think about this stuff even in those early days?
I don't know. I suspect that she was somewhat aware. That the fact that she was writing these letters to William Farr saying, keep it dry, they would have, and he was a super smart guy as well, they would have these discussions about their methods of argument. They would talk about what's going to happen when our ideas are attacked. And of course, they're communicating with this tremendous visual flair, particularly Nightingale. So I think that they were conscious, and she was very conscious of who she was going to send these diagrams to, and the fact that they were busy and they would not read them if they were in table form. So yes, there was definitely a sense there of the potential. But whether they could have imagined back in the 1850s and 1860s where this would all be going, I mean, to think about what Twitter's going to be like. I mean, the idea that you could just tweet something and it gets 30,000 retweets because the data look so beautiful. I mean, who can say? Or
the headline is catchy or whatever it is. Yeah,
absolutely. Who knows? Who knows how much they really understood of what was coming?
I mean, it makes me rethink everything, like clickbait, like how I've been programmed to like, oh, what's that about? And then you click on it, or this says 10% of what, and then you click on it. Like this whole, I mean, it makes me feel like, gosh, are we all that feeble-minded? Are we all that like tantalized by pictures and images and graphs and numbers? Do we all feel this need to say, in this world of like truth and truthiness, the need to validate our ideas as being facts, I think is something that everyone is trying to push for.
Yeah. And one of the points that I make in my book, The Data Detective, is the very first thing you should be doing when you see a claim, whether it's a graph, a headline, whatever, is notice your emotional reaction to it. Because our emotional reactions to these social media posts, these newspaper headlines, these tweets of former presidents, whatever, they are designed to emotionally engage us, to make us afraid or joyful, vindicated, angry. And we need to notice those responses before we then react. Once you've noticed, this is making me feel a bit anxious, or this makes me feel like I was right all along. Once you've noticed that, then you're in a position to actually calmly evaluate the data.
That's the most dangerous one, right? This makes me feel like I was right all along. That's the biggest trap out there.
That's deadly, absolutely deadly. But at the same time, you can be like, I don't need to pay any attention to that. That's fake news. So people can accept things they shouldn't accept, but I think just as dangerous is people reject information that they shouldn't reject. Yeah. What makes me feel so conflicted about Florence Nightingale is she's so amazing. She's so thoughtful. She's so creative. She was absolutely right. She was completely on the right side of history. She won. Thank goodness she won. And yet, at the same time, she was hacking into the same cognitive shortcuts that I see bad people all over the world hacking into today. And so the question I always have about Florence Nightingale is, does the end justify the means? And I guess with her, the answer is yes. But I worry. Yeah.
But this is where I just feel like, this reminds me so much of the work of journalism, which is that the answer does not lie within the tool. The answer lies within the person telling the story. And, somehow we have to get that person to be ethical and to have done the work and to be telling a story that is grounded.
Yeah. So graphs don't mislead people, people mislead people.
People mislead people.
People mislead people, yeah.
Okay. That's a good kicker.
I mean, my big takeaway here is that you can use graphs for revenge. And I'm definitely going to take that lesson away from Florence Nightingale.
Yeah, so nobody crossed Jody.
Yeah. No, but Tim, what's that quote again? Because it is amazing.
It is an amazing quote. Whenever I am infuriated, I revenge myself with a new diagram. Got to go for that, haven't you?
Yes.
That's perfect. All right. Well, we're going to leave it there. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
And Tim Harford, this was really fun. Tell us a little more about the new season of Cautionary Tales.
So the new season of Cautionary Tales is already being broadcast. We have all sorts of stories of mishaps, catastrophes, tragedies. Some are funny, some are awful. They're all supposed to be educational. I bring the geeky social science. And we've got some amazing actors. For example, Jeffrey Wright is playing Martin Luther King, and Helena Bonham Carter is playing Florence Nightingale. And it turns out Helena Bonham Carter is a distant cousin of Florence Nightingale, so it's extra special. And I've heard the performances, they are spine-tingling. They're fantastic.
Our hunch that everyone in the UK is actually related is confirmed here. Tim, thank you very much. This is great.
That's terrific. Thank you.
Once again, the new season of Cautionary Tales from our friends at Pushkin Industries is out now. Tim Harford's new book is called The Data Detective. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported podcasts. Thanks to all of you listeners who have become supporters. There is a form on our website where you can do just that. You can become a monthly member or just give a one-time donation if you are in a position to do so. It helps not just this show, but the work of Radiotopia in general. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And of course, on our site is a way to get in touch with us. If you have any questions or comments about the show, you can also email us, thisdaypod@gmail.com. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kala Nakua does transcripts for every episode. Find links to those on our website. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.